Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel and to this, the final part of the Protector Races mini-series, with this last entry that was sadly only ever made or named a Protector Race, and it's not really a Protector Race, it's more similar to the Elves as it's an offshoot faction after the faction's tragic demise. And this is the Goblins of North Haaraketh. The Goblins of aphalas, like the ogres and the half-ogres, were never meant to be. They were created by Nagrasak when he openly defied the Father, and it led into a very early onset war, but eventually the goblins and the ogres, the half-ogres maybe not as much, but the other two were fairly well seen, and their histories are a bit unique, how they have a lot of cases where their two histories are quite interconnected, and then other elements that are very, very different. And the goblins are developed into quite a cultured force after they discovered the betrayal of Nagrasak. They started forging their own path more so than pretty much any other race, and they started to develop their own cultures, their own way of being, their own systems and everything. And they turned into some of the most ambiguous, I think the best word probably is. You could never tell what sort of side they were going to fall on. You could never tell really what their intention was. They kept very close to themselves. And this video is specifically about Northern Haaraketh. It's not going to be like the Elves where I go into full detail about all the Goblin forces, because a lot of them are tied to Arisen and Onarkivris, and they do not have elements here. But a little just insert, the goblins appeared in three different groups: the Levtris, the Lenaris, and the Lurkren. The Levtris were Clan Akavon and Clan Akabren. The Lenaris were Clan Emenodian, Boasian, and Belasin. And just a point of reference, Clan Belasin are the ones who become intertwined with the Kingdom of Onarketh. They are, if I just bring the map over to Onarketh, they started off, and they were the goblins themselves appeared all quite into the east of Shar when they first emerged, and on the western coasts of Onarkivris. But Clan Belasin ended up occupying the Century, more specifically, and they became its wardens for a period of time before they were driven out, and then they split into two forces: the Unforsaken Rebellion, which unfortunately failed and were destroyed, and the Kingdom of Onarketh, where they met and found refuge with the humans of Onarketh, who eventually came about later on. And so I guess you could say it's actually the other way around. The humans emerged later on. They came into contact with the goblins, not the other way around. But the actual people that we are looking at for today with Northern Haaraketh are the Lurkren. The Lurkren were one of the forces that initially developed on Eastern Shar, but they were a clan that got specifically targeted, and they and upon the sign of the Second Demon War, which was a incredibly chaotic event, which I will be doing some videos on soon, the Second Demon War caused their clan to evacuate, and they evacuated, or they did not evacuate specifically, they went under the guise, or not the guise, under the leadership of a figure known as Yitiguin. And Yitiguin is not a character I have done that much development on yet, but he is tied to their last final leader, who sacrifices himself at the Crisis of Galacaross, and is actually one of the most vital characters throughout all of that event. But they eventually flee to Galacaross, and they find refuge in the old ruins that were still standing of the Stone Elves in northern Haaraketh. The fact that they were even able to get to Galacaross is quite surprising, but they were aided in this by the ogres of of Sarakoth, and which again was one of those things where the ogres didn't have to, but it was remembering the past, because the coalition of the scribe was predominantly goblins and ogres, so they have a lot of close blood with each other. And the goblins remained on northern Haaraketh for quite some time. At the time they had arrived, Sinevia was still imprisoned, and just as a point of reference, she is, at this time in mind, she is imprisoned over on the Arachnyloth archipelago under the watch of the Targs people. But eventually she does escape, and she flees back to Galacaross eventually, after a while. But for quite some time, the goblins were actually fairly well reversed there. The only real contests for combat and things that they had were some remaining pockets of beast elves that had never split into the dark elves, had never travelled over to Shar. They had remained there, so it was odd fragments of the horde of beasts. But the more predominant enemy was the Hounds of Collage, which actually allowed the goblins to develop some interesting weaponry and skill sets, and made them some of the best combatants when it came to handling bestial type creatures. But eventually Sinevia did return to Galacaross, and although there was a lot of effort by a lot of different forces to prevent this behind the scenes, she did make it back. She started with the corruption of the re-corruption of the jungles of Obsidian, which became a pretty much token mustering ground for undead forces. She easily overwhelmed those small pockets of elves left and the Hounds of Collage. And at this point, though, the Goblins of Northern Haaraketh had recovered fairly well. They had been largely left to it by any hostile forces aside from those odd raids, and they received a lot of support from the Trolls of Idros, as in particular the Petrarchians and everything, because it was, of course, the Petrarchian kin, hang on, I'm trying to find them now, Clan Othoyin, who tried to aid the Stone Elves and failed, so you could argue that Galacaross kind of gets a bit cursed at this point, because the goblins try here, but it becomes quite well known that Sinevia is back on Galacaross by them, and they end up in multiple engagements. The fire pits awaken again once Sinevia conjures them, and there's other forces that get corrupted and brought into the fold, which means the forces against the goblins don't only mount in numbers, but they change in variety, which unfortunately means that they started coming up against forces that the goblins have never fought against before, so they had no experience. But they became some of the fiercest fighters. They were skilled. They unfortunately did not have any connection with their kin over at Onocrith, so they had no knowledge of those kind of weapons, but they still had enough variety and supply. And there were pockets of them that attempted to try to make their way to Lossakoth, but all these efforts were effectively prevented for the most part. But the goblins did try effectively one last hurrah, and whilst the rest of aphalas was dealing with the atrocities of Sorrow and Tonroof's war, the goblins did one final push to break out, and it was probably the most costly of all the battles. And the battle eventually will have a name, but I'm still obviously still developing the lore and everything, so it will take some time. But that battle is going to be shaped up to be like a make or break retreat, and it succeeds. The goblins do a good proportion of the goblins do escape, and unfortunately, the ones who actually remain are not killed. They are taken prisoner and then corrupted and twisted to Cenobia as well. Not corrupted in the sense of elves into orcs. They are still goblins. They still maintain the physical features. It's just their minds get twisted. And Cenobia just adds more forces to her ranks. And from this point, she effectively just builds up. She starts to muster the forces and everything. But the thing about it is that the goblins, they don't try to flee west because going to the trolls is the most predicted thing that they could do, and they don't try and flee north to Lossakoth either. Because the actual escape that they make is from the bottom of southern Haaraketh, it's not the north. And for a time, they try to rest on Arisen. For a while, they try to get there because this predates the aphalas barrier at this point. But, or no, it doesn't predate the aphalas barrier, but the leader who they are now behind, and I have got his name down. He's literally one of the only named goblins at the moment, and I cannot for the life of me remember what it is. But he is a ruby mage, and he's a ruby mage with a rare ability of being able to reach out to others, and he was able to draw in some Kirindrek forces, and they open up, and a small collection of them with some agility support open up a little bit of the barrier to allow these forces through. But eventually they do, and for a time here, they do try to get their rest and everything. But this is around the time where Arisen is having its own issues, and eventually the goblins are discovered by the Fayoun, who unfortunately at this point again had been dealing with attacks from not only the Ice Elves but also some forces from a couple of the tribes that the Ice Elves had formed a temporary alliance with, and those forces included goblins, so they deemed these guys a threat and were too protective. So despite the efforts of the Kirindrek and the Ajati, the goblins, after a time, a couple of years, they ended up being driven off of Arisen, and they effectively had to circumvent, and thankfully at this time Cenobia was being held back in some description by Amendiel and the father, and in this time the goblins were able to make it back to Lossakoth, although for quite some time this again was remained secret, and their leader had actually pretty much made them hidden to all forces, because this experience against the Faerun made them not really trustworthy of anyone, including humans. So because at this point as well, we have to maintain the case that the only humans that these goblins have ever come into contact with have been ones that have been deceived into Senevia as well, or were members of the Faerun who just openly attacked them. So, yeah, they haven't exactly got the most amount of trust at the moment. So they flee, and they do make it to Losikoth, and it's a couple of years whilst the Years of Sorrow get wrapped up and everything. But once that is seen, and the goblins wanted to wait longer than this, but they couldn't because news reached them that Senevia and Galeria as well, that Senevia had broken through. Amendiel warned his sister, and he warned the goblins, who still paid homage to him and everything, even though they were never involved in the coalition of the scribe. But that's more because they were driven off before it even happened. So, but they end up traveling into Destinal and explaining to the forces on Destinal what was happening. And this is at the beginning of the actual Crisis of Galacaross. And Senevia, once she's mustered her forces, which doesn't take too much longer after that, she immediately sends forces after the Twin Isles and the Ogres of Haaraketh over here. And because of the Years of Sorrow, both of these forces have been so vastly weakened that she's able to run roughshod over them. Her forces completely overwhelm Naros and drive Orohorn and his remaining trolls, because at this point the trolls are split, and forces them back into the Underlands. Kalonareth is seized and overwhelmed, and Berenhir and his trolls try their best to fight, and it's this point that Tonrith also realizes his machinations of splitting the trolls have sort of failed, and realizing that this is a greater threat and Berenhir is about to lead the trolls and fight a part of that into their own destruction, Tonrith turns around and kills Berenhir. But the ogres also suffer, and they get driven quite rapidly. At first, they're into Cabohearth and Amatroth, their two cities, but neither one lasts particularly long, and eventually they get forced into the mountain holdings of Hedo Lake and Hedometh. The goblins are not involved in any combat for the first few years of Galacaross, because it's mustering the forces, it's organising the different forces of humans, and quite simply, there's just not enough of them to really challenge any of these things on their own. But eventually they do join the forces, and they push on. Senevia launches raids against the Dark Elves of Steotha, attempted at Losikoth and at Revlaror and Cafaltir. Revlaror's one actually does quite a bit of damage on the fleet, and the king of the time, Sarnkor, he ends up actually dying in Galacaross because of a poisoned wound that gets inflicted in the naval combat. Cafaltir is a bit of a messy one, and Losikoth, the invasion fails. The Dark Elf capital of Rake actually gets. This is the interesting thing, because at this point Tonrith's also made his way back to Nagrasak, and the ogres have been forced to flee, and it becomes the Battle of the Dead and Demon. Senevia's lieutenant sends, or Narakash, who is a corrupted ogre trained in obsidian and corruptive magic, he sends the undead forces from their previous battles up, and they get met by the legions of Meada demons. So you have a almost innumerable battle of the undead and demon. And even with the power of Nagris Extermesne, eventually Tonroof knows that it's just not enough because they're holding on, but he also understands that that's only half even of Senevia's forces, which isn't even the case. But it's the fact that Narakash, being that powerful of an obsidian user, is able to just summon up the corpses as they fall. And eventually they do get broken through, and the invasion of Shar continues. But Galacaross will get his own story as well. The goblins, Yitzhak, that's his name. He's a descendant of Yithaquin. And he helps advise, and the thing that he personally participates in throughout some of this time, which actually delays Senevia a fair bit, which is incredibly vital for what happens, he joins the leader of the Ajati of Kalas Tinir, or Tibos. I get those two muddled up a lot. Jelkorn, the current king of the dwarves, some Dark Elf support, and the last son of the Ogre King, and a couple of Ogres of Saragoth, and they go over with a specific mission in mind to effectively try to assassinate Senevia. It's an ill-advised mission, but it's a mission that goes ahead anyway, with Tinir being equipped with the Bow of Kalas Tenhir, and Jelkorn being equipped with the Axe of Adalar, two of the ancient weapons that can actually kill the creators. They go there, and almost immediately the plan starts going wrong. They land sort of between Northern Haaraketh and the jungles of Obsidian, and try to make their way in there. The Obsidian jungle then starts awakening, and they start getting surrounded by undead forces, but they make their way in at the expense of a couple of the dwarves and ogres with them. They go in, make their way up. The ogre prince, because he's a king in exile more than anything else, and I will try and find his name just to be specific about this. I have a lot of lore things. It's just trying to find the right one. There we go. Should be on this. It's either the king was Saronth, and the Saronth the First, that is, and it's either no, it's not Dragon, because Dragon is the one who survives. So it's Ralkern, because Zirnak also falls. But where is Ralkern? No, I think it might actually be Zirnak, because something else happens with Ralkern. I'll have to recap it, but Zirnak, whichever one it is, Zirnak or Ralkern, they enter in and they burst forward with their own guard to try and hunt down Senevia, armed with the Axe of Adalar, which was entrusted to them by Jelkorn. And pretty much the rest of the party beneath only hear a growl and then a blood-curdling scream. And not even a piece of armor gets remained. Like there's just nothing left of him. And they can hear Senevia approaching, and whilst they're panicking and everything, Yitzhak is actually doing something else, and he's casting a spell, and it is a spell that pretty much seals his own fate as well, because he uses up pretty much the last of his power. He casts a mass illusion over all of Galacaross, which basically makes Senevia even think that the fire pits of Baralarth have been extinguished. The flames are out, which means no more demonic forces, no more Meada, no more Korothadar, or anything like that. And he is able to keep this spell going for the better part of a year before it just becomes too much for him, because he has to consistently maintain it. But it is a testament to how strong of a Ruby Enchanter he is to be able to trick a creator. And Gelcorn also sacrifices himself when they attempt to flee, and he makes sure that Tinir escapes there with the Boakalas Tenhir, because the actual weapons that were left at this point, because after this, Senevia then gains possession of the Axe of Adalar, and also already holds the Scarlet Axe because it was stolen by her people during battles against the trolls. So 2 of the 5 weapons that can kill the creators are now in her possession. The Bow of Calistan here, the Spear of Arakan. What's the other one? Wait. Or is it just those 2? Oh yeah, it might only be 4 weapons because the other 2 things are the Crown and the Staff, which can't technically kill them directly, like the weapons can. So, yeah, she has 2 of the 4 weapons, and which dramatically reduces their capability of fighting them. But something that happens during their retreat is Galeria actually comes down and actually occupies her own mother, who is Senevia. She occupies her, and with a brief duel, when basically a duel of actual fighting and also of words, and it buys enough time for Tinir to escape with Yitzir, and they are pretty much the only 2 who make it out of there. And there's Galacaross is a fast and quite chaotic story. There's a lot of different elements that happen to it, like Rake, the Dark Elf capital, it gets placed under siege about 3 times. Tonreef, after the Battle of the Dead and Demon, because he doesn't participate in the rest, he flees up and conceals himself within the Pyramid of the Deceased and actually ends up slaughtering the Dwarven guards there, and which are discovered in one of the larger battles to come, which is in the desert against the forces of Senevia, by either Lazan or Letkan. Which one? It's been a while since I've looked at these royal lines and things, so Lazan, there. But fast track through the rest of Galacaross, where this is maintained, so over a year later, with all of this going on, and the forces of Galacaross, Senevia, have been pushed back both from the forces of Shah with support from Destinal, and the forces of the Twin Isles, supported again by Destinal, because Destinal broke into 2 groups to do this. You had the Wood Elves, Cavoltir, and I believe Talamarith go one way, the Rover, Tarasu and the Dragons go the other. And they both attack, and this is pretty much the only time, this is the last time more so, that all the forces of these areas of aphalas are united. They attack Galacaross from both sides, and they're able to push Senevia's forces back more and more. I also believe, though, that this is where King Kalern of Cavoltir, whose death spells into the Cavoltir Civil War, I believe that this is where his father, Kalerth, or Sellerth, depending on how you pronounce it, I believe this is where he is killed. Oh no, I just remembered that. Yeah, it is seeing that because I remember what happens with Railgun now. I've just remembered. Yeah, Calerthes. Just wanted to bring out something else because I'll add something on to the end. That's not it. This should be it. Nope, I've just seen it. I've got too many PowerPoints. Here we go. Because, okay, I'll find it in a second. The goblins end up on the first waves of the forces to actually push into Baralarth and everything, and this is where effectively the real. Nope, I jumped to conclusions about Earth because, and I can't believe I forgot this. Yitzhak and his goblins sacrifice themselves to effectively open the breach of, or open up the gate and hold it open of Baralarth and the actual fortress on the mountain. And the goblins go into this pretty much crazed last stand frenzy almost. They chant out for their fallen kin. They chant out for the things that have happened to their people and their distant cousins of the other clans and all the rest of it. And they just burst in and just break through so much. And it's not one of these things that they break through and are able to win the day and everything. They break through, but then do quickly get overwhelmed and separated and cut down. But Yitzhak himself, like, he's used up all his magic, and even Ruby magic isn't necessarily the most combat effective thing. He personally tries to hold the gate open, and other goblins do try to help him as the forces of Cafaltir primarily break through first, and other forces quickly follow afterwards. But Calerth personally seeing Yitzhak do this, and a couple of his guards move alongside the goblins to defend Yitzhak as long as they can, and the leader of the last leader of the Goblins of Northern Haaraketh, and the last leader of the Goblins of Clan Zerin, and the last of the Lurkren die basically side by side with the King of Cafaltir, Calerth, and they both fall together at the gate. And a statue later then gets resided back within Cafaltir of the two of them together. But the two leaders fall victim, but being able to keep the gate open allows these forces on the western half to break through, which then diverts forces away from the other defences. That allows the eastern forces from Shah and Destinal to also break through. And the fortress is overwhelmed. The areas around are fought off by other small pockets of forces, and Senepia herself is personally and finally slain by Tinir and Thoronsia, who are wielding the Bow of Kalas Tenhir and the Spear of Arakan. And after this last piece of heroic Gander, Galeria sacrifices quite a significant part of her power to destroy Galacaross, the Isle. The Isle itself gets fractured and only ruins remain. The rest of it gets sunk. And it's to basically rid of this dark place that Zenevia was able to create. Which means the place that saw the destruction of the Stone Elves and the last stand and death of one of the Goblin clans now, and the birthplace of the Stone Elves, Sea Elves, and Beast Elves, which then develop into some of the Dark Elves. And that place is then destroyed. And I mention that because Yitzhak obviously was a key part of allowing that to complete, because Barrelath is a mountain with a lot of catacombs to it. So Zenevia could have been hauled up on there for years, potentially. And, I mean, at this stage, Galeria is there, and what I mean by when she sacrifices a lot of her magic, she can no longer take the form of a phoenix. She is stuck in human form from now on. That's the power it gets taken from her to do this. But at this point, when Zenevia was back here, she was arguably the most powerful singular creature in all of Aphalas at this point. Nagrasak's still banished. Galeria was there, but was waning. Amendiel and the father were both gone. The dragons didn't exist yet, and even when they do, they are not as powerful. The creatures that were pretty much the biggest challenge for her in terms of any one set of creatures, aside from those wielding the creator weapons or magic, were the Togsfolk, the giant scorpions that held her in prison. But she fought them to escape. It was a tough battle, but it was one that she won. And this is what I wanted to list as well, because Galacaross is an incredibly significant event. You have the death of Berenhir, you have the death of... No. In terms of kings and leaders, you have the death of Yitzhak, Kalerth, the Yitzhak of the Goblins, Kalerth of Kavoldir, Berenhir on the Trolls that pretty much fell corrupted and became Talonsar, Irohorn and his entire clan, which had broken off in the Civil War. You had the death of do I have it here? Come on, I must have it here somewhere. You have the line of Fortizga from Rovlaror, and you have the deaths of two of their family. You have Martek, their eldest son, who gets killed in the invasion of Idros, and you have Kylith, who had been the commander of the Rovlaror fleet that went to aid the trolls during Galacaross, and he was the heir to Farallon, which is the region of Rovlaror that House Fortizga reign, and he was killed. Oh no, he wasn't killed. He was a notable member there, and he's the current heir. He's not killed. Sorry, I misread that. I believe Vern here from Line Hirith, Finlane, who would also be from Line Hirith. No, that's not the case. That's not the case at all. There's still Tonri's War. Ignore me on that bit. Rovlaror lose a few named characters. And Sankor, whilst he doesn't die in Galacaross, he dies from wounds inflicted on there. So, two human kings die in Galacaross. One troll king, although kind of self-proclaimed troll king, although he was the heir, a clan chieftain, again kind of self-proclaimed but still a leader. So you have two notable humans and two notable trolls get killed. You have Yitzhak. You have where the heck are you? I haven't got the right one open now. Duh. You have Zarkath and his unnamed son, who were the king and heir of Steotha. They both get killed. Zarkath in the defense of Rake, and his heir, his unnamed son, who gets killed by actually Ralkern. And this is the bit I wanted to go back to and bring up just in terms of just giving a little insight to what Galacaross does and causes. The Ogres of Haaraketh at this point are being led by Saronth. Saronth dies at the hands of Senetvia's ogre lieutenant Naragash and his three sons, and this is where it comes very close to having more than one lineage and line wiped out during Galacaross. Sianak dies in a vain attempt to try and kill Senetvia. That goes as wrong as it could have gone. Ralkern is in league with Senetvia secretly, and he moves to basically try to assassinate his younger brother and Zarkath of the Dark Elves to throw Steotha into disarray and to eliminate the Haaraketh line and any competition that Ralkern would have. Ralkern dies in the attempt. Dragarm is actually brought to safety by the dwarfs of all people under Gelcorn, and Zakath's son gets killed, which leads Zakath to killing Ralkern. And then Zakath ends up dying in the Siege of Rake, the third and final siege or attack on the capital city of Rake. He dies in there whilst most of the forces that were coming to Shah were preoccupied defending the Sparakalas tenure to the north. So they try to rush over to try and find him, but it's too late and he's killed by that time. Yeah, Berenhir, Orahorn, they both die as well. The Dragons come out fairly unscathed. The Wood Elves come out rather unscathed. The Dwarfs lose Gelcorn. The Catholtir humans lose Kalurth. There's a lot that happens. You have King of Rothloror, one of the eldest son of House Fortizga, clan leader of the Trolls, king of the Trolls, leader of the Goblins, king of the Ogres of Haaraketh, their two eldest sons, Zakath and his eldest son. So, yeah, you have, and obviously Senetvia herself. So, altogether, you have, and Gelcorn, you have 12 altogether, 12 notable figures who get killed in this only really decade-long crisis. It's not more than that. And that's just a little insight to the scale, because whilst 12 doesn't seem like a lot, in the actual standpoint of it, it left the Trolls without a real true leader aside from Lezarir, who's another figure. and at a point of them completely being fractured and weakened, the ogres will have literally just their one prince left, and that's it in terms of their people, in terms of their family, that lead and everything, which could have sent them into disarray. The Dark Elves lost their king and their heir, which leaves them just with Sarkarth's daughter Zelkin, who has a lot on her plate. The dwarves get out rather unscathed because they do have family members to Gelcorn. Same with Relvaror and Fortizga, although Galacaross, with the imminent death of Sonkor and the death of Kalerth for the Cavoltaire humans, that sends things into complete disarray for both of them. So Galacaross itself may not have been Senevia's world-threatening thing like she would have liked, because even if she had beaten through all of these forces, Onokrith was still about. Arisen, the archipelago, they were still around, and I mean, all in all, the forces of Dracons and Wood Elves and the northern human kingdoms, Talamari, Tarasil, they didn't get that badly affected. The Temple Guard, again, didn't get that badly affected, so there were still other forces that could resist. But yes, this was the round-off part for the Protector races, but I mixed it up with some insights into Galacaross as well, because it's kind of difficult to talk about Northern Haaraketh without bringing up Galacaross. In the lore is probably the most significant thing that's ever going to be in this stage of this clan's following in terms of the goblins, because at the time of the, because I will just give another little tiny insight into the goblins themselves. At the time of the books, because the goblins do not appear in the books either, obviously the Lurkren are completely wiped out, aside from maybe a couple of offshoot ones that managed to make it to Arisen or made it to the Steppe tribes or something. Aside from that, they're gone. That clan, that bloodline of goblins is just gone. The Levtris, Clan Akavon, are probably one of the first peoples in all of aphalas to be destroyed. Clan Akabren survives, and alongside Clan Akabren, Clan Akabren and the Lenariz bloodline as a whole, so the 4 clans from that, all are still around technically. They're not known as those things anymore. They formed the coalition of, Clan Akabren, Clan Amadine, Clan Eminosian, and Clan Boisian all formed the coalition of the Scribe to some extent, although Clan Akabren were the first to also form the Free Riders. But the others formed into the coalition of the Scribe, then they became the Lost. Some did actually seek refuge in the realm of Haaraketh, or Northern Haaraketh as it became. They did for a while occupy the south as well. But most ended up actually going to the Free Riders, the survivors, so the majority of goblins now reside on Arisen within the different steppe lands and everything. Some operate out of Garalane, but the majority are in the steppe tribes. And the only other ones are obviously the ones who are now a part of the kingdom of Onokrith, which is pretty much only the ones from Clan Bellasin. So Clan Bellasin is like the polar opposite of the Lurkren. They completely avoid all of these combats. They avoid the coalition of the Scribe and all the rest of it. And they are now in the kingdom of Onokrith, which obviously is probably not the safest place to be, but they're a key part of it. But that is it and I'm kind of glad to be, because it's been a bit longer than I intended, and also my voice is still struggling. But yes, the goblins are quite an interesting one to say, and they were a fun one to create. Because the one thing I did not want to do was make the goblins evil, or have them entirely evil, or how they are in Warhammer or Lord of the Rings or these things. Because as much as they do differ in these things, there are elements of the figure that kind of transfer beyond each of them, and I wanted to have mine go down a bit of a different road, like I did with the trolls and things like that. But I will say that the goblins are never really the most trusted of people, kind of have that in common with the ogres, but maybe less deserving of it. But part of that, and I will say part of that, is because two of Nagrasag's Conrokes before he got Tonreeve, because there were several before Tonreeve, two of them were goblins, which really doesn't help people's interpretation of them. But yes, right, I will say I have absolutely no idea what's going to be the next lore series. I need to think on that for a little bit because I would like to go into detail about some of the actual conflicts, but there's also other things I can do. I can cover the peoples, I can do maybe a bit of a longer series that does a proper sort of breakdown of each of these things, the royal lines, or not the royal lines, but what I term the race trees. But I would, if people have a preference on what they would like to see, please do say in the comments because it helps a lot and it would also help give me a bit of direction because right now there's so many different ways I could go with another lore series and I'm just trying to work out which one's probably the best. So, or maybe two of them, which would be kind of nice because whilst I have tied the stream content in with the YouTube now, obviously, as well, I am trying to, it's meant to be a balance and a balance that leans more on book content than gaming, and I am trying to get it to that stage, but yeah, it takes time, obviously. But yes, and at some point I also need to do a half ogre video. I need to just sit down for maybe like a month and just do nothing but half ogre lore in terms of lore work because they need development. But yes, and I didn't bother with face cam because it would have occupied the map and all that. But thank you all for watching, and please do comment, like, and subscribe. Please do comment if you have any ideas or if you liked the video. Please do give it a like. Please do share it. All the rest of it, it all helps. Please do check out the links in the description. And welcome to the Kingdom of Aphalas and the world of Fellowmind books.